when you read a book that is full of symbols, you have to be careful. Ezekiel's a book that people can get into a lot of trouble. If you've ever, and again, I don't know, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but sometimes you'll hear when you read some of Ezekiel, this is one of the books where you'll have Christians that are like, the Bible does talk about UFOs, and the Bible does talk about, you ever hear that, by the way, don't listen to the rest of the story, but that they're giving, but it comes from Ezekiel. Ezekiel is like one of those books where he's trying to show symbolism that he doesn't understand. He's trying to express it, and it's pretty wild. The first 3 chapters are all introduction and the call of Ezekiel. It opens with a vision. It opens almost like right away with a vision. God's glory is apparently not confined to the temple in Jerusalem. And there's this really elaborate narrative told. It's a really powerful, so first 3 chapters, he talks about, the things that he saw. I'll just read a little bit of it just so you can get the context here. I looked, verse 4 of chapter 1, behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and they had the likeness of a man. Each had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings. Each of their 4 faces these things are terrifying and creepy. And if you try to just literal draw them, they're just monsters, So we don't know. I mean, it seems like he's describing angelic beings, but in some kind of a symbolic, the book of Revelation uses some of the same imagery. And so we shouldn't walk away going, these are some creepy looking, freaky looking angels, but more it's about what they represented, not necessarily how they looked, even though that's how he describes it, okay? So in chapters 1, 2, and 3, a lot of symbolism. It's introduction. It's powerful. Chapter 3, verse 1, Son of man, eat what you find, eat this scroll, and go and speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat the scroll. And he said, Son of man, feed your belly and fill your stomach with this scroll that I give you. So I ate it, and it was in my mouth like honey. Then he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with the words to them. For you are not sent to a people of unfamiliar speech and hard language, but to the house of Israel. I always used to share that. This was a great missionary passage to teach, and I would always, make the joke that most of us were sent to places of hard of language. Ezekiel got to go to a place where he spoke the language, but most of us had to go to places where we're unfamiliar speech, hard language. But he says, verse 7, the house of Israel will not listen to you. They will not listen to you. And behold, I have made your face strong against them, and your forehead as strong as against their foreheads. Like adamant stone, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. This is the very beginning of the book of Ezekiel. God is saying think about how this must have sat with Ezekiel. God says, I'm going to make you harder than the hard people I'm going to send you to reach. You notice the Lord never says, I'm going to soften their hearts through your message. I'm going to touch them. He just says, you will be harder than they will be. I'm going to make you tougher than the toughest person in Babylon at that time. So it's a really, really, really beautiful, interesting section. The next 20 chapters, chapters 4 through 24, are prophecies against the city of Jerusalem, against Judah, and then very specific against the temple. It's prophetic words, symbolic acts, and he's foretelling the doom of Jerusalem. And it's what we would call the second siege of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city earlier, and then in 586, he sacked the city of Jerusalem. The glory of God in these chapters, in chapter 10 we see it, and in chapter 11, the glory of God departs from the temple. So Ezekiel has this vision and this prophetic expression that God is removing himself from Jerusalem. That would have been a really powerful thing to them. Okay? In the next several chapters, chapters 25 to 32, Ezekiel prophesies against the surrounding nations. He prophesies against the surrounding nations. The nations around Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt, and then eventually he even prophesies against Well, the one place he does not prophesy against, by the way, Babylon. He prophesies against all the other countries, but he does not prophesy against Babylon. Now, other writers did. Isaiah does, and so does Jeremiah, but not Ezekiel. Okay, then you get to chapter 33 all the way to 39. And once again, Ezekiel's going to prophesy against Israel. He's going to prophesy against Israel and a final vision of the future salvation for Israel. So these chapters deal with the Jews in exile. It deals with Israel and its future, that there's going to be blessing and there's going to be restoration. That's a common theme in all the major prophets, that God is going to discipline, he is going to deal with, but he's also going to restore. And then when you get to the very end of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48, it's a vision of a full and future restoration. The priest prophet, Ezekiel was priest, but he never operated as a priest because the temple, he was deported before he was able to serve. How do I know that? How do I know that Ezekiel, okay, I've given you clues, and I'm going to see, it's not a test, but I said to you that Ezekiel he was deported later. He was born in Israel, deported, but he never served as a temple priest. You want to know the clue to knowing how I know this? Or not I know this, we just know this to be true. How old was Ezekiel when he began prophesying? I told you the answer to that, Ezekiel 1. He was 30. He hadn't started serving yet in the temple. His time hadn't come up yet. He never did that. As far as we know, he never served in the temple. What he did do was he turned from priest to prophet. God called him. There was no priesthood in Babylon, but he was still a prophet. And so he prophesies as priest and as prophet. He gives a really long, maybe the longest description in the Bible of the restored temple in all of its glory. Ezekiel is, as I already mentioned to you, it's a book often. I mean, this is every end times person's greatest dream. They love this book. And you're saying, wait, don't you love end times? Love end times. Usually Ezekiel 38 and 39. Again, if you're into this stuff, you'll see it. It's all over the place all the time. Israel being attacked from the north. Israel, by the way, almost everywhere that Israel gets attacked is from the north. It's just the way it is. But so we'll get to that. We'll get to that next week. Okay, Ezekiel. Lived. Okay, so he's in Israel, but then he's taken into. So he has the experience of knowing both perspectives. He's been in Israel and in Jerusalem, but then he's also had a real serious. Most of his life is going to be in Babylon. There are some major themes that go on over and over. One of the major themes. This is a unique one to the book of Ezekiel that I already mentioned in we call these the signs and the acts, and that is the extreme measure of living out something. Ezekiel's the most famous for that. Way more than Isaiah, way more than Jeremiah. Ezekiel's also known for he's given a phrase by God. He's given a title by God, or maybe it's not even a title. The way that God speaks to Ezekiel is a name that is also used exclusively by Jesus in the New Testament. Son of Man. You son of man. Now, to Ezekiel, this means something very specific. That he's a son of man. Why then is Jesus referred to as the Son of Man? Guesses? It's not a trick question anyway, I promise. Okay, yeah, that's fair. He was born on earth. He's fully man. He was not just God, he was man. He's identifying with humanity. Did you want to say something else? Is that it? Okay. We're on the right track. Exactly right. There's no mystery to this one. But it also connects him to a prophetic type of ministry, doesn't it? He is the Son of Man. So Ezekiel is called over and over and over the Son of Man. Now, that title for Messiah had not been understood yet in Ezekiel's day. But at the same time as Ezekiel, there is another prophet who will write and use the title Son of Man and say that the Messiah will be called the Son of Man or be known as the Son of Man. Anybody know who that prophet is? He's a contemporary of Ezekiel. Somewhat. Daniel. Okay, Daniel. Daniel will refer to Messiah as the Son of Man. Okay. This is the longest, I told you, the longest section in the Bible about the future restoration of a temple. Not a lot of books that talk this, nobody talks this much about it. But this is an extensive look at a future temple. He's going to mention, and I'll talk more about it next week, Ezekiel 38 and 39 are apocalyptic. We call them apocalyptic chapters. And they circle around the name of these two names. Anybody know the two names in Ezekiel 38 and 39? Gog and Magog. That's right. Gog and Magog, we don't know. Magog, Magog, who cares? Tomato, tomato, right? Yeah. Gog and Magog. We'll talk about that next week. There's a long prophecy against the city of Tyre and the king of Tyre. And it seems to be, it's been a very difficult chapter. Chapters 26, 27, and 28 can be a bit confusing because it seems like he's talking about Tyre and the king of Tyre. And then it switches over to, he's definitely talking about Satan. And so no, the king of Tyre was not Satan, but also it seems like there was this, like he's talking about Tyre, and it seems like, so what we would call like a progressive revelation, like it meant both. It was not one or the other, but he's kind of writing about both. So it's a very interesting, it's like a fallen angel, a king of Tyre. It's definitely first to the king of Tyre, but then it's definitely to Satan. So it's very, very interesting. There's, Ezekiel is most concerned with the rituals around the temple. He's most concerned out of Isaiah and Jeremiah about purity and about holiness. He has a clear vision of the law. It's different than the first 5 books of Moses, though. There's even, by the way, just to say this. Ezekiel knew the law. He's a priest. He really knew the law well, and he writes to the rituals and the purity rituals and the not just the practice around the temple, but the meaning behind it in a really, really deep way. Ezekiel's in exile. The temple has not yet been destroyed, but he foresees these things, and he's talking about the holiness of God. So for Ezekiel, the temple destruction is not just the end of like an era, but it is a breaking of the relationship of man with God. It was a severe ending of relationship between God and man. And so it's a really, really powerful type thing. You know, after we finish with these prophets, you know, once you get, there's this like season, there's this window of time in human history where we have no scriptural voice. That doesn't mean that God wasn't giving prophets and speaking to people, but there's no, 400 or so BC until John the Baptist. There is no real deep divine voice being spoken. And now what happens in the world, what are the main things happening in the world during that time? In terms of voice, can you think of anything? It's definitely the rise of Rome. So all Western civilization thought comes from that time period. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. Our whole process of thinking starts from that time. The reason I say that is because just think about how much has shaped the way literally we are the product of a Greek and Roman thinking. Now you're going to say, no, I'm Christian. I get it. I'm just saying the cultures that we're a part of, the whole Western civilization was built on the idea of republic, built on the idea of Senate. I'm not talking of political stuff. I'm talking like the idea of representation, the idea of the logic of a Plato, the scientific mind of an Aristotle and a Plato. These were shaped by this thinking. The reason I say that is because the Bible was written before that, the Old Testament. That's why it's so hard for us. When you read books like Ezekiel and you read books like Daniel and you read books like, well, just all of them, we process it through the one time in human history there was no divine prophetic voice. So what was there? That might have been, honestly, in all fairness, it might have been the height of human mind achievement. There's like windows in time when you have like the greatest minds and you're like, how did that happen all at the same time? But you think, back to back to back, you had three of the greatest minds ever. Their thinking opened up whole new avenues and branches of science and philosophy and medicine and, I mean, you name it. But this is what it looked like, you know, like, I mean, the way I would describe it, like if you were talking about this philosophically or just like thought, like that period in human history was the sentence, God and theology is the period mark. But when there was none of that. They just were like, how far, it was like the Babel of human thought. They took it as far as you could go in thinking without God involved really at all. It's quite phenomenal. But we're shaped by that. We're all a product of that. And then you read into that. So here's what makes the New Testament so exciting. They were also shaped by that. And so it's, you know, when you and I read the New Testament, we're like, oh, it's a lot easier. Oh, it's because it's about Jesus. It's also because they thought more like the way you and I are used to thinking. The Old Testament, they just thought very different. They lived in such a different world. So Ezekiel is a product of a world pre-Greek thought civilization. The context of, let me go back to this. The context of Ezekiel is going to be Jerusalem, but from Babylon. And that's a really unique thing. Here's why. Now, he's Jewish, but here's why. Think about Jonah, and we'll get there soon. Right? Who did Jonah prophesy to? Nineveh. Where did he prophesy to Nineveh from? Don't overthink it. It's not a trick one. Where was Jonah when he prophesied to Nineveh? Nineveh. Where was Ezekiel when he prophesied, easy for me to say, to Jerusalem? He was in Babylon. You see that? Most of the time when God was going to, like, he would send the person to the place. Ezekiel's unique. He's prophesying to the exiles, but he's also prophesying to people who were not even, where he was not even there. And they didn't have email. There was no Google. There's no even post system. But yet he's prophesying to them. So that's a really unique thing, right? There's a real centrality to the person of God. Like, not the triune God, but God. God, Jehovah is very central. Now you're going to say, he's central to the whole Bible, but really central to the book of Ezekiel. Another major theme to the presence of God is the glory of God. Ezekiel was really consumed with the glory of God. He represents, like the vision of the glory of God represents a view of God as he is the God over all creation. He is both spiritually and physically, he's over all things. And so Ezekiel is really, remember, he's a priest. He's deeply aware and really knowledgeable in the law. And you would say, well, of course, he's a priest. Well, I hate to break it to you, but a lot of them didn't know a lot about the law of God. They knew their process. Like, hey, you show up and you are the one who pours the oil into the candle, candelabra or whatever. You just do your thing, right? They didn't all know the law really deeply, but he was really, really well versed in the things of God, in the temple, in the holiness of God. Holiness was a huge, huge and constant theme. You can see it in Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel 5, Ezekiel 20, Ezekiel 40 through 43. He's talking all about the holiness of God. Despite the covenant that God made with his people, The people were rebellious and they were disobedient. And because of God's divine holiness, he was going to bring judgment on the people. So what is the nature of their judgment? It's that God is a holy God, and he has to righteously deal with sin. But holiness was counterbalanced with hope. Where there was holiness, there was also a message of hope. And it wasn't just hope like, hey, one day things will get better, but it was a very clear sense that there will be restoration. You will be restored. It's one of the things that I think, actually, no, I'm going to restate this thing. I believe this is the most missed part of the prophetic word. This element is the most missed. Here it is. Because when you see people try to act out, be like an Old Testament prophet today, I've got a prophetic word. It usually is of judgment. It's negative. Okay? I think the thing that's most often missed in the prophetic word of the prophets was hope. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. They were not just, you're all doomed, I'm going to go lay on my side for a year. It was also, there's a hope of a future restoration. And so I think when somebody will say hey, and I'll hear or read something online, this person's got a prophetic word and America better turn back to God. And it's always America. Why are we always the ones having to turn back to God? Why can't everybody have to turn back to God? Why is it always us? You got to turn back to God. But there's no message of hope. And I would objectively state it's wrong then. By the very nature of where's the hope part of the prophetic word? And not only was it true in the Old Testament, but then you get to the New Testament when Jesus rises from the dead. Now there's complete hope. And yet sometimes you just hear about these things in the context of doom and gloom, and there's no hope. So, very, very dangerous. The temple is the place of God's dwelling. The temple is the place of God's dwelling. And so when God removes himself from the temple, it wasn't that he was like, well, I'm just going to leave that place. That was a symbol, that was symbolic of the fact that God was leaving. Ichabod, right? Ichabod, the glory has departed. Kabod doesn't really mean glory like we would say, but it means weighted glory, like substantive. Like the glory of God is, do you remember when we read about God filling his presence into the temple when they first built it? And what happened to all the priests that were in there and the people that were in there? It was just the priests. What happened to them? They all had to leave? They had to go out. Why? Because the glory of God filled the temple. The glory is the water. It's weighted. There's substance to it. In some way, when God came and filled the temple with his glory, everybody was pushed out of the building. So then imagine this. The worst thing possible was when God would say, Ichabod, the glory has departed. So what he's saying is, in essence, you can have your building back. That's in essence what he's saying. You can have your building back. And so what then was the point of a building that was designed to house the glory of God if God left the building? It was a serious, serious thing that Ezekiel's talking about. It was not just a simple, God's not in the building, you guys need to repent so God will come back. It's not like he just leaves, temporarily. It's like, no, God's departing from there. He's leaving. There is hope in your future, but he's leaving right now. And so that was a really, really, really serious message. One more, and then if there's some questions around the big picture of Ezekiel, if not, I won't bore you too much. But then next week I want you to prepare, if you're willing. Well, you're already reading, but we're going to look at 37, 38, 39. Those will be our key things. But the last theme that I'd want to mention to you that I think is really important in the book of Ezekiel, he describes, or he refers to this as the wrath of God. The wrath of God against Judah, against Israel, against the Jews in exile, against the nations, against the rulers. This is a common theme over and over in Ezekiel. The wrath of God is not arbitrary. It is not vicious. It is, listen, wrath, when we use the word wrath, we mean something very simple, right? It's usually not meditated or premeditated. It's just a reactive, right? You're angry and you just lash out. That's how we use the word wrath. It is not what it means in Scripture at all. It means the steady resolve of God's holiness to deal with and destroy evil. The wrath of God is that God is steady, that he is going to destroy evil. His wrath is provoked by the sin of the people. The sin that he's dealing with in the book of Ezekiel will be primarily idolatry, Sabbath breaking. You think that's not a big deal, but we can talk about that a bit. They will defile the temple. They will put their faith in other nations rather than in the Lord. The wrath of God rests upon sinful nations. So, they broke the Sabbath, not a big deal. It was reflective of a disobedience to God. Like, I don't trust God. Right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit on Sunday. Well, maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot. The idea that, Peter's going to talk about it's better to suffer for good than to suffer only for evil. And it's a message that, like, when you read it, like at church, you're like, yeah, that's good. But if you were to read it in most contexts, you're like, I don't like that at all. Why can't the message say you don't have to suffer at all? Like, do you notice he doesn't make that a choice? Peter doesn't say, hey, don't suffer for doing evil, just do good and you won't suffer. He says it's better to suffer for doing good than evil. And you're like, well, I can give you one even better than that. I'll tell you the one that's better, no suffering at all. But Peter doesn't make that a choice. And we're going to talk about what does it look like, because it's really what the whole section has been about. What does it really look like to live out your faith? Like when it really counts, what does that look like? And it'll hit us because it's difficult. The reason I'm bringing that up is because we can say, well, what does it mean to be a Christian? Just do the rules. Do what God wants you to do. This is how a lot of people see it. It's a transaction. I do this, God does this. I do this, God does this. But we live in a world that doesn't abide by those rules, right? And so bad things just happen. So then what does obedience to God look like? Do I obey so that I get the blessings? And Peter is going to tell us, you're already going to be blessed by God. Even in our disobedience, God is for you. But yes, there is more blessing in obedience, for sure. But more than that, it's what it looks like to really live out your faith, is to obey. When? When you're not doing so hot. Not when you just had a bad day, woke up on the wrong side of the bed, your coffee didn't hit right. No. When for you doing good, you're treated spitefully. And he's going to dispel, and this is an important one because it's common when we read the passage in 1 Peter, we connect it to Old Testament ideas of like, you're doomed, it's all over. Peter's, in essence, going to say to you and me on Sunday, we'll look at it deeper, he's going to say this, hey, not everybody's against you, but when they are, this is what it can look like. Because sometimes we get this like, everybody's against me. Can you think of a famous person in the Old Testament that said, everything is against me? Jacob. Everything is against me. Quite literally, the next chapter, God was going to show him that his son was alive and they were going to all be saved. It's amazing how in one chapter our lives change like that, isn't it? Everything is against me, right? And so it's easy to kind of see the world like that. Everything is, the world is against me. The world's not against you. There's elements that are. The thing that's been more against you than anything is the devil. The devil's against you, that's clear. And probably the second contributing factor to against you that has worked against you the most, what do you think it is? It's you. It's you and me. I mean, it's me. It's me for me, you for you. Then I would add then the world itself. So we'll get into that, but it's really the idea of the wrath of God, that God is steady and consistent in his righteous anger at sin. And it culminates when Jesus became one of us and died for us. The wrath of God was consumed. Quite literally, the word is this: extinguished. Extinguished at the cross. Have you ever just been truly like, and you feel, and you're justified, you have all the reason to just be so angry, and imagine that God just poured out all of his anger, all of his wrath, all of that righteous, all that steady, consistent anger was just poured out on his son Jesus at the cross, so that it would be true that God has no more wrath towards you or me. Now in the New Testament, we read about the wrath of the Lamb. It's very different, right? Who's ever seen an angry lamb? I'm sure they're out there, but that's a different thing. And we talked about that in the book of Revelation. So, do you guys have any questions about, yes, ma'am? And I'm going to do that next week. Thank you so much. So stay the same thing next week. Just kidding. You won't have to. I'm going to do it. I got it. We're going to do Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, kind of that section. But I got it. But we'll talk about that one on next week, because that's really fun and really fascinating. Good question. You were quick at that too. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so in Ezekiel 16, you're going to have to say it again, or even that they were about harlots. And so what was the question? Well, in Ezekiel's context, it's spiritual idolatry. But yes, it was going on. Whoa, absolutely. Yeah, in Ezekiel 16, where it's more symbolic. But to answer the question you're asking, was there there's a reason they call it the oldest profession. Always been around, yeah. Yeah, and again, like we're on this trajectory as citizens of 2024, right? Humanity of 2024, where we're like, oh, the world is worse than it's ever been. And arguably, that's just not true. Now, again, bummer, I guess, if you're like, but it has to be terrible. We mix up. The Bible doesn't say the world has to be the worst that it's ever been before Jesus will return. Let's be really clear about that. It doesn't tell us anything. Jesus can come back at any moment. In fact, they believed that he was going to come back in, the year 40 AD. So, arguably, there's a lot that is not as bad, as there were. And I know we're going to say, oh, but this thing is still happening on a bigger scales. The world was a really, really, really evil place. And the gospel was a massive shift in, the idea in the scripture is that it had Jesus not come and died for the sins of the world, then humanity was going to be over. It was absolutely done. But then this transformation that God's bringing through the gospel has literally changed human civilization. And, the love of many will grow cold, the Bible says, right, in the last days. But when it comes to actual, the way that it's expressed, and I'm bringing that up just to your question about, prostitution, all that, the world was always a really, really, really dark place, yeah. Really dark place. Yes, sir?
So the church, us, we're really closed and even unkind to weird things happening in the church nowadays, gold dust, whatever. And to help us process...
Wait, say that whole thing again, because that was so fun. Every word you said was so fun, but I need to hear it again.
The church, we're so closed to...
The church, we're so closed.
We're so closed to when we see weird things happening
Okay, we're closed when we see weird things happening. Like gold dust. Wait, what is the gold dust? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's be a little cautious.
Yeah.
So how do we process nowadays when one of these manifestations may be happening? Our first thought is it was fake,
Right.
you know. So help me. How do we process nowadays when maybe one of these it happened with the laughing or laughing or whatever?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Laughing in the spirit, slain in the spirit, all that, yeah.
Process something
Yeah.
nowadays when someone a church says this manifestation is happening in the church.
Yeah.
Because our first thought is like just kind of.
Okay, let me say it so that, because it's a great question. Because Dan's not here. Dan, you're not here. I'm going to just go ahead and, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just picking on him because I thought of him. Okay, so how does the church process when we see these or these manifestations that are odd to us, unique, different, weird, whatever word you want to use, they happen. We tend to process it very negatively. We automatically say it's not real. We shut it down before we even give any thought to it. We close the whole group down. How should we process them? Did I do it right? Okay, good. I was making sure I did that right. Next question. Just kidding. That's a great question. That's a great question. And that was a huge part of our kind of, it's a really big part of the story of kind of Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel is born out of a Pentecostal church movement, right? You all knew that? If you didn't know that, welcome. The Foursquare Church, the Foursquare denomination, Pentecostal. The Foursquare denomination was started by a woman. I say that just because Calvary Chapel has become very extremely male-centered, and yet the history of the movement was what we would call egalitarian, both men and women in ministry roles. And then, so the Jesus People movement, right? The whole hippies getting saved thing. All of the theology, all of the teaching, all of the doctrine comes right out of the Pentecostal church movement. There is no new theology that came from that time, okay? When Calvary really began, it's a Pentecostal church in essence. What made it different was not its theology. It's that they let a bunch of dirty hippies come into the buildings. It was the practice that was different. So speaking in tongues, praying in tongues, believing in all the gifts of the Spirit for today. This is Calvary's story. Over the decades, Calvary has moved from their Pentecostal root to much more of a Baptist church. I'm not putting the Baptist down when I say that. We functionally believe in the gifts, but practically don't exercise them. That's a reality. I don't think that's a good thing, but it's a reality. And a part of that has been, so there's two things, Javi, to what you said that are happening. I'm using kind of the full terms just to be clear on it, and then I can unpack it if needed. There's a theological arrogance that we believe we know better right away. That's one problem. And the other one is we've moved away from even our own history of believing in the gifts of the Spirit in practice. If you read anything that Chuck's ever written, he has a really famous book called Charisma versus Charismania. And his practice of the gifts of the Spirit were to be this. Let's practice the gifts of the Spirit, but let's do it in a way that is natural. In other words, not every service, at Foursquare Church, every service ended in a conga line. I'm being silly, but everybody's got to have a prophecy. Everybody's got to have a tongue. Everybody's got to this. Everybody, and Chuck read 1 Corinthians 14 where it says the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. So it means when somebody would say, I just have to say this in church, Chuck was like, no, the Bible actually says you don't have to say that in church. You have the power to just not say it right now. No, I have to say this, right? There was that kind of, I have to get this out right now because God's telling me to. The real change that kind of Calvary brought into the Pentecostal circles was to say, you actually don't have to say that out loud. But I have a tongue, you need to hear it right now. No, we don't have to. Go do that. And so Chuck was really famous for saying, that's what our home groups are for. That's what our prayer meetings are for. That's what our, they had a prayer meeting at Calvary up until I was there, a prayer meeting where if you went in, they were prophesying over you before they even asked your name. And I remember Joy and I went in and got prayer. They were prophesying over what we were going to be doing next, how God was going to lead us. I mean, some things that like most Calvaries, I don't know, really realize that. Calvary Chapel is a Pentecostal church wrapped in a Baptist suit. And what's happened is it kind of shifted and we kind of became more, and again, I'm not putting either side down, but that we're a bit more of like I'm using the phrase theological arrogance. That means how we see the Bible. We're right, and the assumption is if we're right, others must be wrong. Where does that come from? Well, let me tell you where it comes from. It comes from the fact that we sometimes forget there are things that are of the most importance, and then there's other things that are just good. Okay, let me explain what I mean. If you ever go to a church that says Jesus is not God, how important do you think that is on the scale? This is of the most importance. Central doctrinal truth. Central Bible truth. A church that says Jesus is not God, what do we call that church? Yeah, right, we're going to call them Mormon. Jehovah's Witness. Right? It's not Christian. Right? Okay. The problem for us, our own movement, I'm kind of an expert in this, okay? Our own movement problem is that we make a major of everything. We never learned how to let some things be smaller. And so Chuck tried, but it didn't work. It didn't stick for the whole movement. So now we take things at the highest, always. And what that's done is that's created islands, I like to call Calvary Chapel. Theological islands. How many of you came from a church not a Calvary Chapel? Most, and again, if you were in leadership, you would know this. Most churches outside of the Calvary world are like, oh, the Calvary people, we have no connection to them. Why is that? It comes from a bit of a theological arrogance on our part. It's not that we think they're not going to heaven, but that we're right. Now again, nobody says this stuff out loud. I'm saying it. I don't believe that. I don't believe it's true. I like to play with the other kids in the sandbox. We're all in on that. It's a fundamental shift, though, from the way many churches operate. That's a fact. So now there was a huge push. So we were a Pentecostal church. And guess what? Everybody was speaking against us back in the day. Biola University had a really famous professor that used to tell his students on the day one, never go to that Calvary Chapel. Guess where every 22-year-old went? By the way, there's a really famous Calvary pastor that came from that exact time. His name is John Corson. John Corson heard this dude say, never go to Calvary. He's like, yo, I'm going to Calvary. If the old guy says don't go, I'm going to go check it out. And that's how he became a part of the Calvary Chapel movement. My point is that we were the ones being seen as on the outside. Now, history has proven they were wrong. And history will prove we're wrong if we're not careful as well. So now, what do? We are called by God to inspect and discern the things that are happening, right? So I'm just going to use the examples, Hav, that you gave. Okay? And I think there's a difference between the discernment that we need to have and the expression of how we speak about other people. Those should be two very different things. I should be allowed, and you should be allowed. In fact, we should embrace it. We should welcome this. We should embrace thinking differently and still being friends. I should be able to, Alicia should say to me, oh, I think about, I'm just using, you're right in front of me. Oh, I think this. And I'm like, I think you're crazy about that. But I stinking love you. You're amazing. And I could actually learn from the way you think. That's lost within our own movement quite a bit. And in a lot of Christians. So there's a theological perspective, and then what I call a missional, how I treat other people. Laughing in the Spirit. The laughing and all started not too far. I mean, the roots of that was not too far down the street from Calvary Costa Mesa. at a church that used to be called Calvary Chapel Yorba Linda. You know it as Vineyard, John Wimber. And that's where that originated. And, and so this is an unfair thing, but a lot of the animosities that exist were practically revealed from a bitterness at a breakup. It had nothing to do with the actual thing itself, but the breakup itself. And so, gosh, even when I was, there used to be people that would come in from Vineyard laughing and dancing, and sometimes even like there would be barking and waving their flags in Calvary Chapel, trying to get Calvary to embrace that. And Calvary's like, what are you doing? This is not us. So let me mention it again. Let me be clear on this. There is no scriptural basis for laughing in the Spirit or barking in the Spirit or being slain in the Spirit. There's no theological basis. I don't belittle anybody who's a part of that because I see no value to that. It's a non-essential to me. That falls into a non-essential category. The same as whether you take baptism immersion or you sprinkle the person. Completely non-essential. It will not change whether you're going to heaven or not. I'm not going to really hang out at a lot of churches that are like, I'm just not into the barking thing. I find it to be taking away from the real reason we should be coming together. I think it's wrong. I'm saying it. Biblically, it's wrong. But I think there's been a posture of real arrogance that we have to be careful of. That was a long answer to a short question, but an important one. And hopefully it gives you a lot of more context to our own, who we are. So a lot of churches, again, it's why we have taken the posture in our area of, we have a lot to learn from the churches around us. We want to work with them. We're all working for the same kingdom, under the same king. I don't care if you danced it more than we do at our church. Maybe we should move a little more, I'm just using that as an example. I don't care if you raise your hands and you dance around and we kind of don't do that. Or maybe you come from a church where you would never raise your hands and then you see these people doing that. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Not for the sake of the essential. So I hope that makes sense. It's really important. Our posture can be different than what we know to be true. I can say that's wrong. Biblically. But, come on, I'm not going to. Like if you were like, hey, I'm looking for a good church, I'm moving to this place. I'm not going to find those ones and say you should go there. But I'm not out to bash. It's not worth it. Not worth it. Yes, last question, I promise. Oh, Tom Holland, the same guy as the Spider-Man. I didn't realize that this morning, and I was talking to a bunch of teachers, and I'm like, any of you familiar with the historian Tom Holland? And they're like, Spider-Man is a historian? Like, no, you guys are teachers? Yeah, Tom Holland. There's Tom Holland, really fascinating. All right. Lord, thank you for the time. Thank you for the book of Ezekiel. Thank you for just your faithfulness. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right. Have a great night, great week. And Sunday, yay for us. See you then.